Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this big world of ours. My name's Lynn Cockburn. I'm in Canada, and we are welcoming you to the first of 3 webinars on Cameroon, Paths to Peace in a Pandemic. This first webinar is called Understanding the Anglophone Crisis and Opportunities for Peace in a Pandemic. And I just want to do a few housekeeping things before we move into hearing from our 3 panelists today. I'm going to say a few more words of introduction, and then each of our panelists will have about 10 to 12 minutes. We're very, very excited to have our 3 speakers today: Julius, Amin, Ilaria, Allegrozzi, and Richard Moncrieff. So welcome to all of you. In this series of 3 webinars, we are going to hear from these 3 panelists about the Anglophone crisis. The purpose of these webinars is to really gain some understanding of the situation, to examine the current challenges of finding a realistic path towards a peaceful and just resolution, to consider the current situation with the pandemic, COVID-19, and what opportunities it might provide for the situation in Cameroon, and to explore ways ahead given the situation. The webinars are being organized by the Global Campaign for Peace and Justice in Cameroon. And we are a very informal group of academics, activists, journalists, lawyers, students, other people from a variety of organizations, concerned citizens from around the world who really believe in the urgent need for peaceful resolution of the Anglophone crisis. We are not taking any side in the conflict. We're nonpartisan, we're not political. We just are urging Cameroonians to seek nonviolent and nonviolent and political, but not military solutions. So a few things about housekeeping for the Zoom webinar. We are going to hear from our 3 panelists. Each of them will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. If you have comments or questions, you can post them in the Q&A area of the screen. We will not be taking questions while each person is speaking or immediately after. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of the session. We are going to wrap up within 1 hour, maybe a little bit more than that. We know that we won't be able to get to all of the questions, all of the comments, but we'll do our best. We have also had some questions submitted prior to the webinar, and we will try and get to those as well. If your internet cuts out or you get cut out of the Zoom, just try and log back in. We will keep going, and you should be able to log back in. If all of us get cut out, we will wait for a couple of minutes, and then we will try and come back in. If there's a problem with the current system, for whatever reason, we will send an email to everyone and try to get going again. So we know that there are many people who are in various places where internet is not as easy. We would encourage you to not use your video camera because it does make it harder to hear. But of course, the speakers will be using their videos as much as possible. So I think that's our plan for today. I'm just looking at my notes to see if I've missed anything, but I don't think that's it. So we're going to begin with Julius, Amin, and just a quick introduction. of Julius. He's alumni chair in humanities and professor of history at the University of Dayton in the USA. Dr. Amin has written on several topics, including Peace Corps, youth protest, Chinese foreign policy, and now, of course, the Anglophone conflict in Cameroon. He is from Lewo in Cameroon's southwest region. Welcome, Julius. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope I was able to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Again, I want to thank Arcadia and Lynn for organizing this. This is an opportunity. I want to thank my other panelists who are here to speak. And I want to thank all those who have tuned in, especially given the moment in which we are, the moment when COVID-19 has literally hijacked the world. COVID-19 aggravated an already difficult situation in Cameroon's Anglophone region, which has been engulfed in a conflict since October 2016, when a peaceful protest started by lawyers and teachers turned violent. Cameroon's President Paul Biya responded to the protest with arrest, and voices that call for complete cessation of the Anglophone regions gained momentum and created a virtual Ambazonian republic. They formed a military wing, Ambazonian Self-Defense Force, which attacked and disrupted economic and social services in the region. The crisis attracted global attention and headlines. The Guardian newspaper described what is taking place in Cameroon as genocide. The Conversation likened the crisis to an emerging Rwanda. The New York Times labeled Cameroon as a country on the brink of civil war. Typically referred to as Africa in miniature, Cameroon was annexed first by Germany and later split into two unequal halves, one half handed to Britain and the other larger half to France. In 1960, French Cameroon obtained independence, and the following year it reunified with British Southern Cameroons to form the Federal Republic of Cameroon. Though Cameroon's Anglophone region make up roughly 20% of the country, it produced a significant portion of the country's exports. Anglophones felt cheated out of the center of power and the nation's economic wealth. The population was mobilized and vowed not to rest until the tide was turned. Initially, protesters were not deterred by government forces. Interviews conducted in Cameroon revealed their determination. For example, quote, "You cannot kill an idea with military weapons," was one respondent's answer to a questionnaire, an answer reflecting the opinions of many. Interviewers declared that the protest was against, quote, "military occupation of the Anglophone regions, colonial oppression, government corruption, discrimination, unemployment, poverty, and Biya's nearly 40 years reign as president." By the end of the second year of the crisis, it was clear how severe the toll had become. Until a few years ago, Cameroon was a nation on the move. Despite its political, economic, and social problems, the country was peaceful, attracting people from all over the world. For example, the University of Dayton had for over 2 decades run immersion programs in the country, so had other universities. Cameroon was also an international center where major conferences, symposia, and cultural activities took place. Traditionally, Cameroon was among the safest nations to visit in the continent of Africa. Tourists flocked to the nation so they could hike the mountains, hang out on the nation's beaches, enjoy the outdoors and the celebrated evening ambience. And most importantly, they had come to enjoy and learn from the people's famous courtesy and communal culture. Back then, not so long ago, the idea of Cameroon reflected the best of humanity, integrity, and respect. But the Anglophone conflict is changing that. The conflict has created a culture of fear and terror in the region. Here is just one story. Listen to these words. They describe the plight of a teacher becoming an internally displaced person. One lady in her late 20s and a former high school teacher in Bamenda noted a member of the Amber Boys came to her class disguised as one of the students. He wore the school uniform and sat quietly in the back. At the end of the class, the student approached her with a warning, quote, "Why are you coming to school? You must obey our orders. I know you. I know where you live. This is the only warning you will get," unquote. It was nerve-wracking, she said, more especially as some of her colleagues had already been tortured. For a moment, she considered escaping to the bush, but decided to get out of the region. Those boys do not joke, she said. She packed up a few of her belongings, left her child with family, and headed to Douala. This teacher's story, this mother's story is not unique. And in addition to the terror, there have been more profound economic consequences. The region's main agribusiness facility, the Cameroon Development Corporation, the very heart of the region's economy, is in ruins. Plantations that once produced palm oil are no longer operational. Workers at banana plantations are brutalized, and rubber processors have been repeatedly attacked. A disturbing aspect of the conflict is the gradual erosion of the people's culture. Let me give you an example. Funeral services are a significant aspect of Cameroonian culture, but it appears these festivities are disappearing. I've heard the stories firsthand. Cameroonians, irrespective of where they reside, typically prefer their burial sites to be in their villages of origin, but not anymore. Increasingly, people are buried anywhere possible. Another example, traditional rulers known for the role they played in things such as conflict resolution and preservation of the people's culture are escaping from their communities, and in many cases, their residences are vandalized. Separatist forces have struck terror among the people, one effective tactic being the kidnapping of communities' leaders. Cameroonians in the diaspora do not come home anymore for fear of kidnapping. Responses to questionnaires reveal an overwhelming concern about one negative impact of the crisis, the impact on the region's youth. One respondent wrote, quote, "Many of these kids have stopped their education, especially those whose parents are not financially viable. Many ladies, especially in rural areas, are becoming premature mothers, while boys become thieves, fighters. These kids now bear a foundation of anger, fear, and misconduct," unquote. Others provided a chilling list of normalized life, quote, drugs, teenage pregnancy, petty theft, armed robbery, baby murders, physical and psychological trauma, school dropouts, rebels, rape, killings, prostitution, and diabolic. It doesn't take much imagination to see that with schools closed, what easy targets youths become, either for separatist recruiters or killings by government forces. So many parents answering the questionnaire lamented the unenviable position in which the conflict put their children. So why should people on this side of the Atlantic care about Cameroon's Anglophone crisis? I answer this question with three challenging observations. First, the Anglophone conflict has been characterized by gross human rights violations. We should care on moral grounds. Evil occurs when good men and women look the other way. In the trail of tears that is human history, atrocities increase in severity whenever the world did nothing. Second, there is no doubt that global powers know exactly what is happening in Cameroon. In June 2018, the US Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and international organizations in Washington, D.C. had witnessed testimonies about the graphic nature of hostilities in Cameroon. But America's policy towards the crisis remains makeshift. Until the recent outbreak of COVID-19, a cursory glance of previous postings at the US Embassy website in Yaoundé revealed mostly business as usual for the two countries. On its official embassy website, meanwhile, France refers to Cameroon as a friend and a partner. It calls for restraint. Considering how vital the country is to its strategic interest in the West African region, one might expect France to say or do more. China's actions in this saga have also been extremely frustrating. At the last forum of China-Africa cooperation in Beijing, no Chinese leaders and none from the rest of Africa made any public statements about the Anglophone crisis. All this is extremely vexing given Cameroon's strategic importance. For many years, the US monitored its interest in Equatorial Guinea from Cameroon's capital in Yaoundé. Cameroon and the US are partners in coordinating efforts against Boko Haram and other global terrorist groups. Cameroon is vital to France's interest in the West African region. The Anglophone crisis could destabilize the region by snowballing into the neighboring countries. Though Cameroon is a small country, the Anglophone crisis can eventually become an enormous global headache. Equally, the African Union has failed the people of Anglophone Cameroon. The organization remains ill-equipped, ill-ready, and ill-willing to take decisive action. It must move beyond its tactics of hear nothing, see nothing, or say nothing. The Anglophone crisis deserves immediate attention. Third, former participants of the University of Dayton Immersion Program are tormented by the ongoing conflict in Cameroon. Many of them interned at the Kumba District Hospital, which was burned down. They remember many sites which have either been destroyed or abandoned. They are afraid to ask about specific people for fear of the answer they may get. They wonder how a country which gave them so much and which became a part of them can so quickly degenerate. They continue to pay attention to the ongoing conflict. Roughly 7 decades ago, the former Allied commander of Operation Overlord during World War II, who later became the 34th American president, David Dwight Eisenhower, cautioned against a reckless use of military force. Quote, "Let us not forget that the armed forces are to defend a way of life." In a few short years, Cameroon's military and separatist forces have managed to achieve the opposite of that advice. They destroyed the culture of Cameroon's Anglophone region. The Anglophone conflict will eventually end, but the tragic lessons of lost generations, of erosion of the region's civilization, of enduring bitterness will be felt for many generations to come. Yet history could hardly have devised a more opportune moment for change. For a start, the BIA team must muster the will and courage to engage more seriously in conversations on the form of government. When BIA became president, he promised the Cameroonian people a new deal, but what he delivered was a raw deal. There is much that President BIA can learn from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose New Deal policy turned America into a welfare nation, addressing in significant ways issues of social concern. Now is the time for bold new directions. Cameroon's Anglophone crisis is also about lack of basic needs. Rather than handing out mattresses, bottles of cooking oil, and a few cups of rice, the BIA government must engage in a massive rebuilding effort to provide housing for those whose communities were burned down. Those efforts will provide jobs and as a result, put money in those communities. People are looking for work, not handouts. On all fronts and on every level, there must be a concerted effort to bring a change in mentality. Anglophones do not belong to an inferior class. Young Cameroonians must see Anglophones represented at every level of government, on every rung of the business ladder, on every management position, on every school, even on every billboard advertisement. Only such a widespread and visible approach can convincingly challenge Cameroon's chronic pattern of discrimination and exclusion. In the age of COVID-19, it is not enough for the Cameroon government to provide guidelines for prevention, such as hand washing and the use of face masks. The government can do more. With a stroke of the pen, the president can place a moratorium on the payment of water and electricity bills for the next 90 days. It can move with speed to make water more accessible in rural areas. People cannot wash hands if they do not have water. This is a critical moment in Cameroon history. The time has come for all sides in the Anglophone crisis to close ranks and assist locals in the region during this hour of maximum need. People do not eat only after all issues have been addressed. They eat every day, in the long run and in the short run. There is hunger, pain, and misery in the Anglophone crisis. I have seen it firsthand. Finally, a little over 60 years ago, in his Ripple of Hope speech delivered at the University of Cape Town, Robert Kennedy stated, quote, "Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the events. And in the total of all these acts will be written the history of this generation," unquote. Folks, do not be concerned about what others are doing or not doing. Just do your part. Thank you very much. Done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amin. It is difficult, even though I think most of us know some of that history. You've given us an amazing overview. It's difficult to hear it once again. I would encourage us to just take a deep breath and know that we can move forward. But thank you very much for that overview. Our next panelist is Ilaria Allegrozzi, who's going to talk about where the crisis stands and human rights abuses. Ilaria is the Senior Central Africa Researcher at Human Rights Watch. She previously held the same role at Amnesty International, investigating conflict-related abuses in Cameroon, Chad, Central African Republic. She's lived and worked in Africa for 15 years and brings a wealth of experience to our topic today. So welcome, Ilaria.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about Cameroon. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I will articulate my presentation on 3 points. The first one is the evolution of the crisis in the Anglophone regions in the last year. The second point is the massacre in Garbu, which I see as a turning point. And the third one is concerns the human rights implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the first point, I would say that the human rights situation in Cameroon's Anglophone regions has significantly deteriorated in the last year. Throughout 2019 and at the beginning of this year, Cameroon's security forces have continued to carry out abusive counterinsurgency operations in the Anglophone regions. Abusive because they do not always aim at hiding out separatist fighters, but often to retaliate against the local populations perceived to be supportive to the separatists. This has led to serious human rights abuses. Killings, burning of homes, arbitrary arrests, detention, torture. Torture is systematically practiced in Cameroon's detention centers, both legal and illegal, and we have largely documented that. On the other hand, separatist groups have continued to extort, kill, assault civilians. They have targeted the security forces, they've targeted government officials, they have prevented hundreds of thousands of children from going to school, depriving them of their fundamental right to education. They've also continued to enforce their weekly strikes, ghost towns, lockdowns, and they have also recently attempted to prevent local elections from taking place. As it has always been the case since the crisis began, we have observed peaks in the violence around key dates. Last year, for example, in February, around the celebrations of the Youth Day in February, when there was a 10 days lockdown declared by the separatists, which significantly restricted freedom of movement and hindered humanitarian access. And then again last year in August, when there was a new escalation of violence after a military court in Yaoundé handed down life sentences to the 10 leaders of the Ambazonia government, interim government, following what I would say was a very flawed trial. But there was violence again. Separatists called for 2 weeks lockdown between August and September. They declared that people should stay home. They declared that school still would remain closed until the leaders are released. And then again, from November last year to February this year, there was a new escalation of violence. Violence, I would say, escalated dramatically. This was due to the announcement of the local elections. Attacks by the separatists escalated, and consequently also heavy military operations across the two regions with major consequences on the civilian population. The violence in the Anglophone regions has precipitated both the North and Southwest into a major humanitarian crisis. There are now over 670,000 IDPs, 50,000 refugees in Nigeria, and plus thousands of Cameroonians are making their way to Europe and the United States. Access for us has been a main challenge. I was denied entry to Cameroon last year. Our Central Africa director was able to travel to Yaoundé in January to meet the authorities, but we thought that this was an encouraging sign, but in reality, we changed our mind after the release of our report on Garbu, because the government strongly opposed our work and carried out instead a defamation campaign against Human Rights Watch and other organizations. Also, let's bear in mind that this crisis in the Anglophone regions is happening, is unfolding in a context of broader political repression and crackdown on civic and political space. Last year, hundreds of members and supporters of the main opposition party, the MRC, including its leader, Maurice Kamto, have been arrested. We're talking about a country, Cameroon, where any demonstration of dissent, however peaceful, of the opposition or of the civil society is generally dispersed with tear gas, with water cannon, and oftentimes with live ammunition. President P has been in power since 1982. He has shown very little interest in opening up the political space to allow for political opponents and civil society to express their voices and concerns, and instead he has invented various forms of exercising power, which mostly rest on brutal repression and of dissent. Now, my second point is in Garbu, the massacre which took place on the 14th of February in the village of Garbu in the northwest. Why do I think this was a turning point? Not because of the modus operandi of the security forces, not because of the gravity of the crime, not because of the government's response, but for another reason, for the heightened engagement of the international community prior to Garbu. The international response to the Anglophone crisis has been very limited, but following this massacre, I think that things have changed. In fact, I mean, like, I don't think that the modus operandi of this incident was surprising. First of all, ethnic Fulani militia had already been reported to operate alongside the army in previous incidents. Secondly, also the implication of the BIR into the massacre is not new. The BIR, the elite unit of the Cameroonian army, has been accused of serious human rights abuses in the past, torture, killings, burning of homes, and their responsibility into the massacre in Garbu doesn't, really come as a surprise to me, given their very poor human rights record, their history of abuse, and also the widespread feeling that they are above the law. Also, the nature and the gravity of the crime is not new. Research from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other organizations has shown that the killings in Garbu were deliberate. They were aimed at punishing the population for accused of supporting the separatists. And also, however shocking this might be, the killings of children is common. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have previously documented numerous cases of killings of boys and girls. And I think the most striking one was even filmed in this awful video in the far north in Zelevet, which I'm sure everyone remember. Now, also the response of the government was a déjà vu, very predictable. In front of the blatant evidence of abuse, the government usually denies any responsibility. It did it in the past, and after the massacre in Garbu, the government strongly denied that its security forces committed these crimes, instead fabricated a story, justified the violence, dismissed the killings as collateral damages, while Human Rights Watch and other organizations were able to provide a timeline to explain what happened and to back everything with witness testimonies and even satellite imagery. So the government response was vitriolic. Richard will speak after me, will confirm that authorities have embarked in a smear campaign against human rights organizations, against even the United Nations, against me personally, in some really misogynist and personal attacks. So what was new for me after Garbu was the mobilization of the international community. The massacre was widely condemned, including by actors who have been silent in the past, like the United Nations, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and France. This is really changing the cards on the table, I think. And I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think the international pressure now tells Bia's government that the world is watching. The message that international partners sent was very strong, indicated also that abuses won't longer be tolerated. And I think that at the Human Rights Watch, we are really determined to make this case the emblematic case it deserves to be made, and continue to ask for the findings of the investigation to be made public, for an independent investigation, and we will continue to push on this case. Last point, if I still have time, around the human rights implications of COVID-19 pandemic. At Human Rights Watch, we start from the assumption that this pandemic exacerbates existing inequalities. And we are using the framework of 4 intersectional areas to guide our work to protect the most vulnerable people: institutions, migration, tech, poverty, and inequalities. On Cameroon, we have already released a couple of products, a dispatch on overcrowded prisons, some of the most densely populated across the African continent. We have advocated for the release of pre-trial detainees. This unfortunately didn't happen, as the decree promulgated by the president, who resurfaced a couple of days ago after a month, only concerns few detainees and will lead to some indeed be released, but definitely not those arrested in connection with the Anglophone crisis and not the political prisoners. Also, we have published another presser highlighting the need to respect rights among this pandemic, calling on the government to grant unhindered access to humanitarian organizations to assist those in need. Again, this didn't happen because the government is yet to provide any authorization for humanitarian flights to resume. In the meantime, the cases have climbed. I'm really concerned about the fact that despite the testing is being rolled out, the capacity for testing is not decentralized. And also I'm concerned about the pandemic that could be used as an excuse to quell dissent, to divert the attention from pressing human rights issues, including accountability for military abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. Our third speaker is Richard Moncrieff. Richard is going to at least introduce some ideas about how we might get to some talks, and if there are some possible opportunities in this current situation with COVID-19. Richard has been the Central African Project Director at the International Crisis Group since 2016. He was previously head of the Africa Research Group in the UK Foreign Office and has worked in a diplomat in Paris, Abidjan, and we're really pleased that we're able to end with you today, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this initiative. And thank you everybody who's listening for joining us. Obviously, I don't know who I'm talking to. That's one of the features of this rather experimental situation. So thank you everyone for joining me. One of the results of that, of course, is I know I'm talking to some people who are in Cameroon and know the situation and other people who don't. So what I would like to do before talking about the current situation, responding a little bit to Ilaria, and about the possible obstacles and paths towards talks, is just try to contextualize this a little bit. Julius began by saying that this is a major crisis, but people don't seem to care. The usual mechanisms of international diplomacy seem to be barely activated at this point. And that is absolutely right. And that is largely because the Cameroonian government and diplomacy is very, very active in trying to shut down any discussion of the situation in Cameroon, which reflects a long-term position of isolationism in Cameroon and a desire to not have the situation more broadly in Cameroon discussed in any international fora. And I think that's a very important factor here, because it is striking that in contrast to several neighboring countries, Central African Republic, South Sudan, even Burundi, Cameroon is not on the UN Security Council agenda. It is not on the African Union Peace and Security Council agenda, despite pressure from some people such as ourselves that it should be, and therefore does not the momentum and the dynamic and even the tools of international diplomacy which could stimulate mediation and an international role in talks is not there. And I think that is very problematic. And certainly I agree with what Julius said about that. Let me just go back a little bit, because you did say, Lynn, that part of the purpose of this is to try to expand our understanding of what's happening in Cameroon. And of course, you know, I have no more understanding than many other people, but I think it might be worth giving something of perspective on this. Why did a country which was known for its stability relative perhaps to its neighbours or some of its neighbours? Why did it enter a civil war 3 or 4 years ago? Julius used several terms to describe the current situation. I think the correct one is civil war. So I've got my daughter running behind me in a classic YouTube moment here. And I think this is very important because this structures what's going on. I've been to Cameroon regularly since 2002, but in particular in 2008 to 2009, I did some research looking at the potential for conflict. And I talked to separatists at that time. And I have to say that I rather minimized the possibility of violence in the Anglophone areas. And I think that was, well, self-evidently, it was a mistake. So I think it's very much worth asking, how did we get here? Now, my point of view is that the Anglophone issue in Cameroon is a function not so much of the colonial history, although I understand that that's a factor, but it's more a function of how the whole country is run. Cameroon is one of the most centralized states in the world. All decisions are made in the president's office. It is also a very corrupt state, very corrupt governance. And there is a relationship between the government and Francophone populations, which is characterized by corruption, it's characterized by fear, but it's also, I would argue, characterized by a sense that the state brings some stability. And we should remember, of course, that Francophone Cameroon had a civil war from the mid-1950s until 1971. And that has informed the way people relate to the state. Now, my contention, and I think this is extremely important because it does lead to various points about how we can address this crisis, is that Anglophone Cameroonians have never bought into the symbolic nature of the state in Cameroon. And they have never regarded the government of Cameroon and the president of Cameroon as being their legitimate representatives. A very frequently used imagery by the government, of course, is a family imagery where Paul Biya is presented as the father of the nation. That's it's littered amongst speeches on Cameroon, including by people very close to the president. I'm not saying that all Francophones regard Paul Biya as their legitimate kind of political father, but I do think that it is very important to understand that Anglophones, although they feel Cameroonian, do not accept the legitimacy of the form of centralized government that pertains in Yaoundé. That leads me to what I think is an absolutely central point here, which is that we, of course, are dealing with a conflict. We're dealing with a conflict which has enormous and terrible human rights abuses that Ilaria has laid out, which, of course, leads to cycles of violence. But underneath this, we are dealing with a question of recognition. And what the Anglophones, in my view, and, you know, again, I'd love to hear Q&A and feedback on this, but what Anglophones seek, in my view, is a recognition that they have been marginalized over the course of the history of the country. Now, if that recognition was forthcoming, the fundamental issues which sparked the crisis in 2016 are not necessarily that difficult to deal with. In fact, there was some progress made towards dealing with them in late 2016 and early 2017. The more fundamental issue is not how do you deal with the language in schools and language in the court system. The more fundamental point is that Yaoundé should recognize that the Anglophones have a historic grievance concerning their position in their own country. That leads to the question of why the government does not make that recognition. And I don't have a straight answer to this, but I think that these are the underlying problems that will at some point need to be addressed if we're going to actually make more progress on this issue at some point in the future. So I put that out there as a broad way of understanding, and I particularly think it can be useful because many people come to the Anglophone Cameroonian issue from the point of view of the Anglophone position within the colonial structure, which I'm not dismissing that, but I think we need to also focus on the way that country is run from Yaoundé for the past 40, 50 years. And I do think that is the heart of the problem. And it does actually imply, as Ilaria pointed out, that there may be more problems ahead in Francophone Cameroon, because while it's brought superficial stability, this way of running a country has very strong underlying fragilities. Let me jump a little bit and address the questions that I've been asked about how we, what are the obstacles to talks and so forth. I would, as I say, I'd put this question of recognition absolutely at the front and center. At the moment, there has been no actual meaningful dialogue between the protagonists. Now that's really very striking. We've had a 3.5-year civil war and there has been no meaningful dialogue between the protagonists. Why? Well, the main protagonists, the ones who have military capacity, do not see it in their interest to talk. The ones who would talk, who do not focus on the military option on both sides, have been marginalized by the hardliners. That's a relatively, common situation in the middle of a civil war. What we need to do is to persuade the government to talk to the separatists because they hold the weapons. Wars don't end any other way. And also to talk to those Anglophones who have not called for violence. Over the last 3 years, analysts tend to call them federalists. We could argue about whether, decentralization, federalism and separatism, where the lines are, because the lines are shifting, because things are polarizing, because violence polarizes political position. But nevertheless, there are absolutely legitimate representative people, Anglophones, who the government can and should talk to, and should do so in the spirit of genuine dialogue. Now I want to just link that to something Ilaria said. Ilaria said is that the Galbo massacre was a changing point here. Well, I hope so. I don't know that that's true, but I hope so. Certainly the, unbelievably clumsy government reaction it stimulated a slightly more hardline or more bold international reaction. I think that's true. I'm not sure exactly where that's going to go. But I think that Galbo comes at the end of a sequence which was kicked off by the dialogue of September. And I think this dialogue is very revealing and very interesting. So for those of you who don't follow it very closely, at the end of September, the government called for a global national dialogue on the Anglophone issue. Now, they did not give sufficient voice to Anglophone representatives. They drowned the conference in representatives from all over the country who came to raise their particular concerns. And most of all, the whole dialogue process was top-down. So I come back again to the nature of the state in Yaoundé and how how Cameroon is run. The reflex and the strategy of the government in Yaoundé was to say, we will have a dialogue, we'll set the agenda, we'll set the participants, we'll organize the whole thing, and we'll invite exactly who we want to, we won't invite who we don't, and called it a dialogue. Well, the whole problem's there. I'm sorry, but the whole problem is represented in that, because that was not a dialogue. It may have had some purpose. It could have had some purpose if it was followed up with genuine dialogue, but it was not a dialogue. So the problem is articulating what a dialogue is. And that's where Crisis Group has pushed to say we need talks. They need to be between the genuine participants in the violence as well as the non-violent representatives. They will need international mediation, they will need talks about talks, and they will need strong international pressure on the parties to get there. But it needs to be actual talks and actual dialogue. And what I found very dispiriting in the international reaction was that after this fake dialogue, this, let's say it was a forum, but it was not a dialogue, of September, October, a number of very prominent international actors went to Yaoundé, congratulated Beer on kicking off a dialogue and said, how can we help? Now that for me is very worrying because it shows that international actors are not willing to really seize this and are not willing to go to the government and say, you've actually got to talk to these people properly. And I think that's what has to be cracked. That's the nut that has to be cracked if we're going to make progress on this issue. And I'd just like to finish by, you know, going back to what Julius says and agreeing. I mean, you know, I think, you know, genocide, I think, is very mistaken. I don't think that's the situation, but we have a major civil war in a large African country, and that no one is reacting in an appropriate way. And I think that's extremely worrying. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Richard. Very, very useful. We are going to run out of time and not be able to address all of the questions. All three of our speakers have been very forthright, very, just very, very clear in their perspectives. But we haven't heard much about women's roles in this whole situation. So I'd like to give each of you a chance to really speak about the role of women in the peace talks or in any other aspect of this situation. Is there room for traditional women's groups, women's organizations? We know that this is often a very male-dominated kind of process. It's really important that we think of how women can be involved in this process. I'm not sure who wants to go first. Maybe Julius?
Let me just say something about that in terms of not so much the role of women, but a lot of the internally displaced persons I talked with were women. I even quoted one of them in my talk. And they have a very powerful story. And so when women get to the table, and I'm sure some other person will be able to address the role of women at the table of the dialogue and the conversation, but I hope that there is a way to listen to the stories of these women who make up the internally displaced persons. This is a story which is heart-wrenching for a nation. This is a story which is very destructive. As I mentioned earlier, for the culture of the country, the role of women in preserving and maintaining this culture. You find this, I talked to some of the young people I spoke with, people who've never went up 2-3 miles out of their villages. They found themselves in Douala from Northwest. And you find 5, I mean, there's one of the apartments I went into, 7 ladies crowded in one tiny little room. They're all coming from virtually the same village. How do you deal with this situation? Talking with them, I could not help. When I walked out, I could feel tears come running out of my ears. So again, as I said, this is an important story. But as far as the role of women at the table where this significant discussions will take place, I will pass it over to my other panelists. Yeah.
I'm not muted, right?
Oh, I was muted. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can hear you.
Well, I'm all in favor for pushing for the a strong role for women into peace talks, if we ever get to the peace talks. I think that women as other marginalized groups should have their say, and also share their experience about what happened to them and to their families. Women have taken up the role of head of households. They've also taken up weapons in certain circumstances. They have been displaced. So they definitely have much to say about how to address the crisis. But I would say that we are not yet to this point. We're far from having any dialogue and sitting around a table. I am in touch with a lot of women in the Anglophone regions, and they share with me their daily stories. They run local organizations, they help displaced people, as other people do. So definitely their role should be encouraged in a country which, as I mentioned before, can be quite misogynist.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you. Well, on the particular question of women, I agree with Ilaria in the sense that women's, when talks occur, and we hope they do, they need to be, as all these kind of peace talks need, they need to be both broad and narrow. They need to be broad because you need to take account of the people who've suffered from a conflict in order to understand how to achieve sustainable peace. On the other hand, they need to be narrow because the people who are doing fighting need to talk to each other, either directly or through intermediaries. Absolutely, women need to be involved as women, and by that I mean as particular victims to this conflict, and women should be involved because women are involved in separatist movements and are involved in other as activists. In addition to that, the needs of women, families, broken families, refugees, internally displaced. There's an enormous amount of internal displacement in Cameroon, which is under the radar. Families packed into houses in Yaoundé and Douala, causing an enormous set of problems. And in the response to the crisis, so I don't mean the diplomacy to get us to talks, I mean humanitarian other responses, it's absolutely critical to take account of the various experiences that this crisis is throwing up, and there women need to be at the center of that.
Thank you. The next question is about human rights organizations in particular. I think we could maybe expand it a bit, but the question is, why have human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Crisis Group not challenged the French government over its silence about the atrocities of the Cameroon security forces and the failure to put pressure to end the atrocities? I think the question about the French government role, we've heard a little bit about that. I'm not sure who wants to start with an answer.
Well, I can start as the question is directed in part to me. We have called on international actors in general. I don't remember if we've named France, but I believe we have in our reports. And we've said that they should bring to bear much greater pressure on the government to enter talks. And we've done that in private as well. So we certainly have. In general, on the French position, well, I mean, that's a very long story, but there is a mixture of, overall alliance with the country. Historically, France has very much dismissed the concerns of Anglophones, and there is historical bad blood between Cameroonian Anglophones and the French government that goes quite deep. The there are some signs that the French government has been getting frustrated with the unwillingness of the Cameroonian government to enter into talks, because, as I said at the beginning, some of the issues which started this off are actually quite resolvable, and the government should talk to the Anglophones. It is a classic case of the need for dialogue. And I think the French are aware of that. And I think the French are also aware that we're entering into a possible period of instability in Cameroon, given the age of the president, and that there are growing problems across the whole country, and that the government is simply failing to address those problems. And I think there's some recognition in the French system that that poses a problem to the country, which is detrimental to broader French interests.
Thank you. We have one, I'm just going to recognize that we don't have much time left, and there's one question that has been asked by many people. So I want to put it out there. We're probably going to go past the hour. The most asked question of our participants today is, what internal or external factors would need to change to bring President Biya and the Cameroon government broadly, knowing that it's not just President Biya, to get into talks, to get at some kind of dialogue, to a table where talks could actually take place to discuss peace. Maybe we'll start with the order. We'll start with Julius and go in the order of the speakers, and we'll end there.
And just a couple of comments. I think one of the key things is while nations, the major powers, and that's why I talk a lot about the major powers, while they continue to pursue this notion of eternal interest, that diplomacy is about eternal interest. I believe that the nations that take human rights seriously and endure or last as major great powers. So it's important for France, it's important for China, it's important for the United States to understand that this is important, that injustice is transient, but justice lasts for a long time. And I do believe that if they tell Paul Biya to come to the table and discuss seriously, Paul Biya will come to the table, or President Paul Biya will come to the table and discuss seriously. So it's up to these major powers. There are certain things which have been done by the sides. Okay, stop trade here and there. No, they know fully well what needs to be done. Right.
So for the major powers to put pressure for talks to happen. Ilaria?
I believe that it's on both sides. You have also to convince separatist groups to come to the table and dialogue, as well as the government. And of course, on the government side, international partners can exercise their pressure, as France and the US and other the UK have done, can continue to do. But for the separatists also would be a sign from the government that it is willing to at least take some steps towards justice and fight against impunity, set a precedent. That's why I told you that Ngarbo can be a turning point. Because if there's a public trial, if there's a public report, if the findings of these investigations are made public, I think that this can change also the cards on the table and can encourage people to move towards dialogue. So I think that finding a lasting solution for the Anglophone crisis is not an easy task, but the fight against impunity is of paramount importance in order to find a solution.
Thank you. And Richard?
So it's the big question, and the very, very difficult one. I largely agree with Julius in that the Cameroonian government is susceptible to coordinated high-level international pressure, and there has been a lack of coordination. I'd come back to this point I made about dialogue. I do not think the international actors should have welcomed the September-October dialogue in the terms that they did. And I think that some international actors are aware of that, that effectively they allowed the government to play for time. And that's representative of a broader problem whereby because Cameroon is not discussed in Addis, in New York, or in any kind of international contact group, which exists for the Great Lakes, for example, there's very little international coordination. And I do think that pressure is important. And that pressure needs to be, it needs to have the perspective of incremental measures that can make genuine progress towards talks. I mentioned recognition. I think that remains a very important aspect. I think we're going to need talks about talks, ceasefires, truces, demilitarized zones, those kind of things we need to start to think about. A lot of those are in crisis group reports, particularly one we wrote last year. And those are the kind of things that need to be on the table. I would just underline that, well, I'd underline two things. I can't quite see the link between them, but let me just say I think there's two very important things to remember here. When you're in the midst of a civil war, it's very, very difficult to see the other side of it. You know, I was in Liberia and Sierra Leone, or dealing with those countries when they were at war, and others, and it is possible to get out of them and get to a more peaceful place. And international actors should remember that, and should remember that consistent and coordinated international pressure over time can help to achieve that. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem of the internal actors. And I do fear that we're entering a period where the Cameroonian government is going to be obsessed with what happens next in Yaoundé. And I think that's probably going to be detrimental to the possibility of getting to talks with the Anglophone, on the Anglophone issue, I fear. But you know, I would just come back to the point that civil wars do end, and we need to bear that in mind.
Thank you. That is a good note to end this session on. I think this will come to an end. If
I just add something very quickly.
Sure.
Thanks very much. I just want to say that there's a huge number of very, very interesting questions on the list here. You know, including questions about.
Yes, I was just going to address that.
How do you address colonial stuff and so forth? I know we can't answer them, but I just want to say how much I appreciate the questions and the feedback. And you know, I'm sure you can find my email or my something. You know, it's just really, really, there's really interesting stuff. It's great to know that people are trying to think these things through.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how I was just going to sort of end this one, to say that many of the questions that have been posed today are really relevant to our next two discussions as well, and we will feed them forward to our next speakers. The next session is May 2nd, and the next one is April 25th. It's on the challenges of identity-based and successionist conflicts. So that will be very interesting. And then the final one is May 2nd on money, military, and international power. So we will inform all of the speakers who have already agreed to be part of those webinars about the questions that were raised today. We will probably consider having an hour and a half rather than an hour for those sessions, given the interest, but we'll see how things go. And let me just end by really thanking our panelists for this morning. You have really made a huge contribution to taking some steps forward in this very difficult time. So thank you very much.